The ashes still glow. The city was gone, a blackened scar stretching to the horizon. Montag stood on the hill, the river gurgling behind him, its waters reflecting the orange flicker of distant fires. The bombs had fallen days ago, silencing the sirens, the televisions, the mechanical hounds. He clutched the book in his hands, a tattered copy of Walden, its pages crisp from the heat of his escape. Around him, the book people gathered, their faces smudged with soot, their voices low as they recited fragments of novels, poems, histories. Granger, their leader, knelt by the fire, feeding it twigs, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. "They'll come for us," he murmured. "The survivors. The ones who still believe in the fireman's truth." Montag didn't reply. His mind churned with Clarice's laughter, Faber's trembling hands, Mildred's vacant stare. They were gone now, swallowed by the blast that had ended the old world. He'd run with the others, memorizing lines from Thoreau as bombs shook the earth. The book people had welcomed him, their strange tribe of living libraries, each carrying a text in their heads. But Montag felt hollow. The war was over, yet the weight of what he'd lost pressed against his ribs. He'd burned for so long, first as a fireman, then as a rebel, and now, in the quiet, he didn't know what to light next. The wind carried ash, dusting their camp. A woman named Eliza, who held Jane Eyre in her memory, pointed west. "Smoke," she said. "Not ours." The group tensed. Granger stood, brushing dirt from his knees. Could be stragglers. Could be trouble. Montag gripped Walden tighter. He'd seen the firemen's loyalty, their blind faith in destruction. If any had survived, they'd hunt the book people down, books or no books. "We move at dawn," Granger decided. "Toward the river's end. There's a valley, old farms, maybe people who'll listen." That night, Montag couldn't sleep. The stars glared down, unblinking like the eyes of the hounds. He opened Walden and traced the words by firelight, whispering them to himself. "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately," the simplicity mocked him. He'd burned deliberately, fled deliberately, but living? That felt distant. A rustle broke his thoughts, footsteps in the brush. He stood, heart pounding, as a figure emerged. A boy, no older than 12, his clothes singed, his eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," the boy gasped. "The firemen. They saw your smoke." Granger was at Montag's side in an instant. "How many?" he demanded. The boy shook his head. "Dozens. With torches." Eliza cursed under her breath. Montag stared at the boy, then at the book in his hands. The firemen had lost their city, their purpose, yet they clung to flame. He thought of Clarice asking about the smell of rain, of Faber's voice crackling through the earpiece. "We run," Granger said, kicking dirt over the fire. But Montag hesitated. Running hadn't saved the world before. Maybe it was time to stand. The boy grabbed his arm. "They'll kill you." "They killed my dad, he had a book." Montag knelt, meeting the boy's gaze. "What book?" The boy swallowed. "Moby Dick." Montag smiled faintly. "A whale in a sea of ash." "We'll carry it for him," he said. The group packed quickly, their voices a murmur of memorized lines. Montag looked back at the dying embers. The firemen were coming, but so was something else, a chance, maybe, to rebuild. He turned to the river and started walking, the boy at his side, Walden heavy in his pocket. The river's edge. The river stretched wide and sluggish, its banks muddy from the rains that followed the bombs. Montag trudged alongside the book people, their boots sinking into the earth, the boy whose name was Sam, clinging to his shadow. Dawn painted the sky a bruised purple and the air smelled of wet ash and pine. Granger led the way, his stride quick, his eyes darting to the trees. "They'll follow the river," he said, voice low. "It's the only path through this mess." Montag nodded, though his thoughts drifted to the firemen behind them, faceless now, stripped of their gleaming helmets, but still driven by the old hunger to burn. Sam tugged at Montag's sleeve. "My dad read to me at night," he said. "About the whale? Said it was about chasing something you can't catch." Montag glanced down, the boy's words stirring Walden's lines in his mind, to front only the essential facts of life. "Did he catch it?" Montag asked. Sam shook his head. "They caught him first." The weight of that settled between them, heavy as the book in Montag's pocket. He wondered how many others had died clutching pages, their stories snuffed out by flame. The group moved in silence, their breath fogging in the chill. Eliza recited Jane Eyre under her breath, the words a soft chant. "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me." Montag envied her certainty, the way the books lived in her like a second pulse. His own memory felt fragile, Thoreau's sentences slipping through his fingers like water. Granger halted suddenly, raising a hand. Ahead, the river bent around a crumbled bridge, its stones charred and jagged. Beyond it, smoke curled upward, not the thick plumes of a wildfire, but the thin, deliberate threads of a campfire. "Scouts," Granger whispered. "Or survivors." He motioned for the group to crouch. Montag peered through the reeds, spotting figures 3, maybe 4, huddled around a small blaze. They wore no uniforms, but their movements were sharp, purposeful. Not firemen, Eliza said, squinting. Too ragged. Sam gripped Montag's arm. What if they're like us? Before anyone could answer, a shout cut the air, a woman's voice, rough with exhaustion. Who's there? Show yourselves. Granger cursed softly. No choice now. He stood, hands raised, and the book people followed, wary but upright. Montag pulled Sam close as they stepped into view. The figures by the fire tensed, one grabbing a makeshift spear, a broom handle tipped with a shard of glass. The woman who'd shouted stepped forward, her face gaunt, her hair streaked with gray. You're not them, she said, eyeing their lack of torches. Who are you? Granger hesitated, then spoke. People with stories. And you. She lowered her spear slightly. We're what's left. Name's Ruth. We ran when the bombs hit, found this place yesterday. Her companions, a man with a limp and a teenage girl with a bandaged hand, watched silently. Montag noticed a book in the girl's lap, its cover scorched but intact, the Odyssey. You've got books, he said, stepping forward. Ruth's eyes narrowed. So? You here to burn them? Montag shook his head, pulling Walden from his pocket. No. To save them. Ruth studied him, then the group, her gaze lingering on Sam. You're being hunted, aren't you? Granger nodded. Firemen. They're close. The man with the limp spat into the fire. Bastards. They torched our town weeks ago, before the bombs even fell. The girl clutched the Odyssey tighter. They didn't get this, she said, voice fierce. Montag felt a spark flare in his chest, not destruction, but something warmer. We've got more, he said. In our heads. We're keeping them alive. Ruth's expression softened, but only for a moment. Nice trick, she said. But it won't stop torches. She pointed east. They're out there, saw their lights last night. If you're smart, you'll keep moving. Granger exchanged a look with Montag. We're headed to the valley, he said. Join us if you want. Ruth hesitated, then nodded. We'll think on it. For now, rest here, but not long. The book people settled uneasily by the fire, their voices mingling as they shared scraps of memorized text. Montag sat with Sam, watching the river, wondering if the firemen's flames would find them before the valley did. The Valley of Echoes. The valley sprawled below them, a patchwork of abandoned fields and skeletal barns cradled by hills that blocked the wind. Montag squinted against the midday sun, its glare harsh after days of smoke and shadow. The book people descended the slope, their steps cautious, Ruth and her group trailing behind. Sam stayed close, his small hand brushing Montag's as they walked. The boy hadn't spoken much since the river, but his eyes darted constantly, searching for the fireman's glow. Montag felt it too, a prickle at his neck, the sense of being watched. Walden pressed against his hip, a quiet anchor amid the uncertainty. Granger paused at the valley's edge, scanning the horizon. Old farming country, he said. If anyone's left, they'll be here. Eliza adjusted her pack, muttering Jane Eyre. I remembered that the real world was wide. Montag wondered if it still was. The bombs had carved craters into cities, but the countryside seemed untouched, too quiet, almost staged. Ruth caught his gaze. Don't trust it, she warned. Empty places hide things. Her spear rested on her shoulder, a reminder of the world they'd fled. They reached a cluster of houses, their roofs sagging, windows dark. The teenage girl, Lena, clutched the Odyssey as she limped beside Ruth's companion, a man named Paul. People lived here once, Lena said softly. Maybe they still do. Granger motioned for silence, then led them toward the largest barn, its red paint peeling like old skin. Inside, the air smelled of hay and dust. Montag's boots crunched on something brittle, scattered pages, torn from a book he couldn't name. Someone's been here, he said, kneeling to gather the scraps. The words were illegible, smudged with soot. A low hum broke the stillness, faint but growing. Engines, Paul hissed, hobbling to the barn door. Montag's stomach tightened. The firemen had no trucks left, no hounds, but survivors could salvage anything. Granger peered through a crack in the wood. 2 bikes. Motorcycles, maybe? Coming this way. Ruth gripped her spear. We fight or we hide. The book people exchanged glances, their memorized texts suddenly fragile against the roar of approaching machines. Montag thought of Clarice, her curiosity snuffed out by speed and steel. Hide, he said. We're not ready. They scattered, ducking behind bales and beams. Sam pressed against Montag, trembling as the engines growled closer, then stopped. Voices followed, gruff, clipped. Tracks lead here, one said. Fresh. Boots thudded on the ground outside. Montag held his breath, Walden's weighed a silent promise in his pocket. The barn door creaked open and two figures stepped in, silhouetted against the light. They wore no fireman's gear, just patched jackets and scarves, but their hands held torches, unlit for now. "Come out," the taller one barked. "We know you're here." Granger signaled to stay still, but Lena shifted, her bandage snagging on a nail. The sound was small, but it was enough. The shorter figure turned, torch raised. "There," he shouted. Ruth sprang first, spear thrusting toward the taller one. He dodged, cursing, and Paul swung his crutch at the other. Chaos erupted, shouts, scuffling, the book people rising like ghosts from the hay. Montag grabbed Sam and lunged for a ladder to the loft, his heart pounding as he pushed the boy up. Below, Eliza tackled the shorter man, her Jane Eyre recitation unbroken. "I am a free human being." The fight was brief but brutal. Ruth pinned the taller man, her spear at his throat. "Who are you?" she demanded. He spat blood, glaring. "Scouts. Looking for runners like you." Granger stepped forward, breathless. "Firemen send you?" The man laughed, a harsh sound. "Firemen? They're dead or mad. We're with the Remnant, folks who want order back." Montag climbed down, Sam behind him, and stared at the captives. "Order with torches?" he asked. The shorter one sneered. "Order needs fire. Always has." Ruth pressed her spear harder. "Where's your camp?" The taller one nodded west. "Mile off." "They'll come looking when we don't report." Granger rubbed his chin. "We've got time then. Tie them up." As the book people bound the scouts, Montag picked up a fallen torch. It was cold, heavy, a relic of the world he'd burned. Sam tugged his sleeve. "They're not firemen," he whispered. "But they're still bad, right?" Montag didn't answer. The valley echoed with their voices now, a fragile refuge turning hostile. He wondered if Thoreau's woods were ever this loud. The Remnant's shadow, the barn creaked under a gathering wind, its walls shuddering as the book people secured the scouts. Montag stood by the door, torch in hand, its metal cool against his palm. The captives glared from their bindings, ropes cutting into their wrists. Ruth paced, her spear tapping the floor, while Granger interrogated the taller one. "The Remnant," he pressed. "What do they want?" The man smirked, teeth stained red. "What's left? Control. Food, land, people. Books just get in the way." Montag's grip tightened. The firemen had burned for ideology. This was colder, hungrier. Sam hovered near Lena, who sat clutching the Odyssey, her bandaged hand trembling. "They'll come for us," she murmured. Eliza knelt beside her, reciting Jane Eyre. "I have as much soul as you." It was meant to comfort, but the words felt thin against the scout's threats. Paul limped over to Montag. "We can't stay here," he said. "Miles not far enough." Montag nodded, glancing at the torn pages underfoot. Walden stirred in his mind. To live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. He wasn't sure what marrow remained. Granger straightened. "We move tonight, deeper into the valley. Find cover, maybe allies." Ruth snorted. "Allies?" Everyone's scavenging now. But she didn't argue. The group gathered their meager supplies. Books, scraps of cloth, a few knives. Montag tucked the torch into his belt, a strange keepsake. As they slipped out, dusk painted the fields gold, the hills casting long shadows. The motorcycles sat abandoned, their engines silent. "Could use those," Paul suggested. Granger shook his head. "Too loud. They'd hear us coming." They trekked west, away from the Remnant's camp, the ground softening into marsh. Sam stumbled and Montag steadied him. "You okay?" The boy nodded, then whispered, "Dad said the whale was freedom. Is that what we're chasing?" Montag paused. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just staying alive." Sam frowned, unconvinced. The valley stretched on, dotted with ruins, silos, cottages, a rusted tractor half sunk in mud. Each step felt heavier, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, like smoke. A cry pierced the quiet. "Eliza," at the rear. "Lights," she hissed. Montag turned, heart sinking. Pinpricks of flame danced on the ridge behind them, a dozen or more, moving fast. "Torches," Ruth said, voice flat. "They found the scouts." Granger cursed. "Run!" The group bolted, splashing through the marsh, their breaths ragged. Montag pulled Sam along, the boy's legs pumping hard. The lights grew closer, their glow casting flickers on the water. Voices shouted, too distant to parse, but the intent was clear. They reached a copse of trees, gnarled and bare, and ducked beneath the branches. Granger panted, scanning the terrain. "They're a gully. Down low, they might miss us." They slid into the ditch, mud coating their clothes, and pressed against the earth. Montag held Sam close, the torch digging into his side. The lights swept past overhead, boots thudding, a harsh laugh cutting through. "Spread out," someone barked. "They're here somewhere." The remnant wasn't firemen, but their hunt felt the same, relentless, mechanical. Minutes stretched, the group frozen, their breathing shallow. Eliza whispered Jane Eyre, her voice a thread of defiance. Lena clutched the Odyssey, her lips moving silently. Montag pressed Walden against his chest, its words a shield. "I wanted to live deliberately." The torches faded, the voices dimming, but no one moved. "They'll circle back," Ruth warned. Granger nodded. "We wait, then double back east. Throw them off." Paul scowled. "And if they've got more?" A rustle came from the trees above, not the remnant, but softer, deliberate. Montag tensed as a figure dropped into the gully, a woman, wiry, her face smeared with dirt. She held no torch, just a slingshot. "You're loud," she said, eyeing them. "Lucky I found you first." Granger bristled. "Who are you?" She smirked. "Call me Sparrow. I've got a camp hidden. You're not remnant, so you're welcome." Ruth lowered her spear slightly. "Why help us?" Sparrow shrugged. "Saw your books. Hate the torch crowd." Montag studied her, hope flickering. "How far?" he asked. "Close," Sparrow said. "But move quiet or we're all ash." She vanished up the bank, beckoning. The group hesitated, then followed, the valley's echoes swallowing their steps. Montag glanced back, the torchlights faint now, a fading threat. Walden pulsed in his pocket, and he wondered if Sparrow's camp held the marrow he'd been chasing. The hidden camp, the gully twisted into a ravine, its walls steep and tangled with roots. Sparrow led the way, her steps silent, her slingshot swinging at her side. Montag followed, Sam's hand in his, the boy's breath quick from the chase. The book people moved in a tight line, their voices hushed, though Eliza's Jane Eyre floated faintly. "I am not an angel." Ruth kept her spear ready, her eyes on Sparrow's back, while Granger scanned the shadows. The torchlights had vanished, but the remnant's threat lingered like smoke in the air. Walden bumped against Montag's hip, its weight a quiet promise amid the uncertainty. Sparrow paused at a curtain of vines, parting them to reveal a narrow cave mouth. "In here," she whispered, slipping inside. The group hesitated, Paul muttering about traps. But Montag nodded to Sam and stepped through. The cave widened into a chamber, its walls damp and mossy, lit by a single lantern. A dozen people waited there, their faces worn but alert, their clothes patched with burlap and leather. Books lay scattered on a stone table. To Kill a Mockingbird, 1984, a frayed Bible, their covers creased from use. "Welcome to the Hollow," Sparrow said, smirking. "We don't burn here." A man with a gray beard stood, his hands stained with ink. "Name's Tobin," he said. "You're the book people, I take it?" Granger nodded. "Heard of us?" Tobin chuckled. "Rumors. Thought you were myth. Folks carrying libraries in their skulls." He tapped his temple. "I've got Gulliver's Travels up here. Keeps me sane." Montag set Walden on the table, drawing gasps. "Real pages," Lena whispered, her Odyssey clutched tighter. Sparrow shrugged. "We've got a few. Hard to keep, but worth it." Ruth lowered her spear, though her stance stayed wary. "You're hiding from the remnant?" she asked. Tobin nodded. "Them and worse. They've got a camp west 100 strong, stockpiling weapons. Want to restore order, they say. Torches are just the start." Paul spat. "Sounds like firemen with dirtier hands." Sparrow grinned. "Close enough. We've been picking them off, small raids, quiet kills. They don't know this place exists." Montag glanced at the books, then at Sam. "You fight for these?" he asked. Tobin's eyes softened. "For what they mean. Freedom, thought. The remnant wants neither." The group settled uneasily, the cave's chill seeping into their bones. Eliza shared Jane Eyre with a young woman who knew Pride and Prejudice, their voices weaving a duet. Lena sat with Sam, reciting the Odyssey's shipwrecks, the boy's eyes wide with the tale of the whale echoing in his mind. Montag listened, Walden open in his lap. I had 3 chairs in my house, one for solitude. The hollow felt like that, solitude shared, fragile but alive. Granger pulled Tobin aside. We're hunted, he admitted. They'll track us. Tobin frowned. Then we move you deeper. Tunnels run under the valley. Safe, for now. Sparrow offered them bread, stale but welcome, and Montag chewed slowly, watching Sam devour his share. You're staying? He asked the boy. Sam nodded. For Dad. For Moby Dick. Montag smiled faintly, the spark in his chest growing. But Ruth's voice cut through. This won't last, she said, standing. They'll find this hole eventually. Tobin shrugged. Maybe. We've held a year. You're welcome to join us or run. Granger rubbed his chin. We'll rest, then decide. Dawn's soon. Sleep came fitfully, the cave stone cold against Montag's back. He dreamed of Clarice dancing in rain, Faber whispering through static, the fireman's flames licking at his heels. A shout woke him, Sparrow's voice sharp. Riders! The group scrambled, Tobin dousing the lantern. Through the vines, Montag saw them. 3 motorcycles, their engines growling, headlights slicing the dark. Remnant! Sparrow hissed, loading her slingshot. They're searching. The bikes circled the ravine's edge, their riders shouting orders. One dismounted, torch flaring to life, its light creeping closer. Granger grabbed Montag. Tunnels, now? Tobin led them to a fissure in the wall barely wide enough to squeeze through. Ruth went first, then Lena, Paul, the others filing in. Montag pushed Sam ahead, Walden in his grip. Sparrow stayed back, slingshot aimed. I'll slow them, she said. Catch up. The tunnel swallowed them, its air thick and stale, the sound of boots fading above. Montag's heart pounded, the torch from the barn still at his belt, a choice unmade. To live deliberately, he thought, and kept moving, the hollow's fragile light behind him. The fire within. The tunnel stretched endless and claustrophobic, its walls slick with moisture, the air heavy with the scent of earth. Montag pressed forward, Sam's small frame ahead of him, the boys' gasps echoing in the dark. The book people moved single file, their footsteps muffled, their memorized words silent for once. Ruth's spear scraped the stone, a faint rhythm, while Granger's breathing rasped behind Montag. Walden dug into his side, its pages a lifeline, and the torch from the barn hung at his belt, cold and unlit. Above, the Remnant's engines growled, muted but persistent, a reminder of the world they'd fled. Tobin led them, his silhouette a shadow against the tunnel's twists. Keep moving, he whispered. Opens up soon, old mine shaft. Safe there. Montag nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. Safety felt like a myth now, chased as fiercely as Sam's wail. Lena stumbled, her odyssey slipping from her grasp. Montag caught it, handing it back, her bandaged hand trembling. Thanks, she murmured, then recited, I am Odysseus, known to all. Her voice steadied her, a thread of defiance in the gloom. The tunnel widened into a cavern, its ceiling braced with rotting beams, a faint drip echoing from somewhere deep. Tobin lit a candle, its flame casting jagged shadows. The group collapsed against the walls, exhausted, their faces gaunt in the flicker. Eliza whispered Jane Eyre. I must keep in good health and not die. Paul snorted. Too late for that. Ruth glared at him. We're alive. That's enough. Montag sat with Sam, the boy's eyes fixed on the candle. Dad said fire could be good, Sam said softly. For warmth. Light. Montag touched the torch at his belt. It can be, he agreed, thinking of the fireman, of Clarice's brightness snuffed out. Granger crouched by Tobin. How long can we stay? Tobin shrugged. Day, maybe 2. Remnant's thorough. They'll scour the valley. Ruth gripped her spear. Then we fight. No more running. Montag looked at her, then at the torch. To live deliberately. Thoreau whispered in his mind. He'd burned once, then fled. Now what? Sparrow's absence weighed on him. She'd stayed to buy them time. We need a plan, he said, voice firm. Not just survival. Something more. Granger raised an eyebrow. Like what? Before Montag could answer, a rumble shook the cavern. Distant, but growing. Dust sifted from the beams. They're close, Tobin said, standing. Blasting, maybe, searching the ravine. The group tensed, eyes darting to the tunnel they'd left. Montag pulled the torch free, its weight solid in his hands. "We can't outrun them forever," he said, "but we can choose how we face them." Ruth nodded, a rare flicker of respect in her gaze. "Fire with fire?" she asked. Montag hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Fire with something better." He turned to the group. "Your books, what do they say? Not just stories, but ideas. Freedom, hope, resistance." Eliza spoke first. "Jane Eyre. Standing up, even alone." Lena added, "Odyssey. Outsmarting the enemy." Sam piped up, "Moby Dick. Fighting what you can't see." Montag held up Walden. "Living on purpose. Not their purpose, ours." Granger rubbed his chin. "A stand, then. But where?" Tobin pointed deeper into the cavern. "Shaft splits. A ridge overlooks their camp." "High ground." Montag nodded. "We take it. Use what we have." They moved again, the rumble louder now, the candle snuffed for stealth. The shaft climbed, opening to a ledge beneath the stars. Below sprawled the Remnant's camp, tents, bikes, a stockpile of torches glowing like embers. Hundreds milled about, their voices a low hum. Sparrow emerged from the shadows, slingshot in hand, bruised but alive. "Took you long enough," she grinned. Montag handed her the torch. "Light it when we're ready." She smirked. "Bossy now, huh?" The plan formed fast, diversion, words, fire. Sparrow and Ruth would draw them out, Montag and the book people would speak, recite, shout, flood the valley with what they'd preserved. Not to kill, but to wake. Montag lit the torch at dawn, its flame steady, and began. "I went to the woods," voices joined, Jane Eyre, Odyssey, Gulliver, a chorus rising over the camp. The remnant froze, then charged, but some listened, their torches dipping. Sam yelled Moby Dick's hunt, and Montag saw it, a crack in their order, a flicker of doubt. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a start. Walden burned in his chest, and for the first time he felt deliberate.